The Mongols were supposed to be unstoppable. From the frozen steppes of Central Asia, they stormed across the world, crushing kingdoms, empires, and dynasties with terrifying speed. China, Persia, Russia, no matter how strong, no matter how proud, almost no nation could resist the fury of the Mongol Empire. But there was one small kingdom that not only stood its ground, it defeated the Mongols. Not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. That kingdom was Đại Việt, the land we now know as Vietnam. At the time, it was a country barely 1/60th the size of the Mongol Empire. On paper, it should have been swallowed in a single campaign, and yet it delivered the Mongols some of their most shocking defeats, battles so devastating that they shook the entire empire. By the time of the third invasion, the Yuan dynasty was determined to erase Vietnam once and for all. They mobilized an army of over 300,000 men, an almost unthinkable number for East Asia in the 13th century. It was one of the largest military campaigns the Mongols ever launched in this part of the world. The plan was simple: crush Đại Việt with overwhelming force and end its resistance forever. And yet, as this colossal army marched south, the Vietnamese commander Trần Hưng Đạo, calm, calculating, and utterly fearless, made a prediction that stunned his men. He said, "This time, the enemy will be easier to defeat." Why? What did he see that no one else did? Because the stage was set for one of the most brilliant military traps in history. The year was 1287. For the Mongols, this invasion was personal. Twice before they had stormed into Đại Việt with their armies, and twice they had been forced to retreat in humiliation. This time, the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol rulers of China, vowed there would be no escape for the Vietnamese. They gathered an army on a scale rarely seen in Asia. Over 300,000 troops, drawn from across the empire: Chinese conscripts, Mongol cavalry, engineers, sailors, and mercenaries. For comparison, most medieval European battles were fought with only a few thousand men on each side. Here, the Mongols brought hundreds of thousands, determined to drown Đại Việt with sheer numbers. And they didn't just come from one direction. The plan was a crushing pincer movement designed to suffocate the Vietnamese resistance. From the northwest, a Mongol general named Aluchi led forces through the rugged mountains of Yunnan, striking at Đại Vit's highland defenses. From the northern border, the main Mongol army stormed across, commanded by Prince Togon, son of the great Kublai Khan himself. With him came Trần Ích Tuc, a Vietnamese royal defector who betrayed his homeland and now guided the invaders. From the eastern sea, Admiral Omar sailed with a powerful navy, while another commander, Zhang Wenhu, followed behind with nearly 500 warships and 70 supply boats, carrying rice, salt, dried meat, and preserved beef enough to keep the Mongol armies fed for months of campaigning. On parchment maps inside the Mongol command tents, it must have looked perfect. Armies converging from 3 directions, supply lines secured, overwhelming manpower pressing against a small kingdom. To outside observers, Đại Vit's fate seemed sealed. But the Vietnamese leadership, King Trần Nhân Tông, the retired Emperor Trần Thanh Tông, and their supreme commander, Trần Hưng Đạo, were not panicked. They didn't throw their armies recklessly against this colossal force. Instead, they turned to something far more dangerous to the Mongols: time. They stalled. They negotiated. They sent envoys with gentle diplomatic words, appearing weak, appearing hesitant. But in reality, every day they delayed was another day for their defenses to strengthen, their armies to regroup, their traps to be prepared. And Trần Hưng Đạo, watching the storm gather, knew something the Mongols did not. An army that large could be crushed, not just by swords or arrows, but by its own hunger. As the Mongol armies thundered toward Đại Việt, panic might have seemed natural. After all, what hope did a kingdom of only a few million people have against the empire that had crushed Persia, toppled dynasties in China, and brought Russia to its knees? And yet the Vietnamese commander Trần Hưng Đạo was calm, almost unnervingly calm. To his closest advisors, he declared, "This time, the enemy will be easier to defeat." At first, these words sounded impossible. How could facing the largest Mongol army, yet the one backed by fleets, defectors, and tens of thousands of seasoned warriors, be easier? But Trần Hưng Đạo wasn't a man who spoke lightly. He had studied the Mongols for years, not just their strengths, but their flaws. He understood their overconfidence, their reliance on supply lines, and the way hunger and exhaustion could break even the fiercest cavalry charge. His plan was not to stop the invasion at the border. No, that would have been suicide. Instead, he chose to let the Mongols march in, deeper and deeper, until the weight of their own size began to work against them. The Vietnamese court under King Trần Nhan Tông and the retired Emperor Trần Thanh Tông fully supported this. Diplomacy became their weapon. Every envoy sent to the Mongol camp spoke softly, buying days, weeks, precious time. The court appeared submissive, even fearful, while in reality, every village was preparing, every hidden harbor fortified, every river studied for the chance to turn nature itself into a weapon. To the outside world, it looked like Đại Việt was trembling before the invaders. To Trần Hưng Đạo, it was all part of the illusion. The Mongols were being invited into a trap so vast that they wouldn't realize it until it was far too late. The Mongol main force, led by Prince Togon, advanced with terrifying speed. Villages burned, roads were cleared, and the cavalry swept aside any minor resistance. Before long, they reached the beating heart of Đại Việt, Thăng Long, the capital city. On the surface, everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. The Mongols had crushed enemies far greater than this. Why should Vietnam be any different? And so Togon rode triumphantly into the capital. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The city was empty. No soldiers, no civilians, no food. The Mongols expected to seize vast stores of rice and supplies that would sustain their army deep in enemy territory. Instead, they found silent streets and abandoned homes. The people of Đại Việt had vanished into the countryside, taking everything with them. Even the wells were poisoned or hidden, denying the invaders the simplest comfort of water. It wasn't the first time the Trần dynasty had used this strategy. It was known as the empty city tactic, a scorched earth approach designed to bleed the enemy without a single sword strike. The Mongols had seen it before in earlier invasions, but this time it was worse. The capital was nothing but a ghost city, a hollow prize. And here lay the first crack in the great Mongol war machine. An army of hundreds of thousands could not simply march forever. It needed grain, salt, fodder for the horses. It needed supply lines. Without them, the unstoppable cavalry became little more than starving men on exhausted animals. In Thăng Long, frustration turned to anger. Soldiers looted, but there was little to take. Horses grew weak. Men went hungry. Rumors spread that the Vietnamese had deliberately lured them in, and soon, discipline began to falter. For Prince Togon, it was a chilling reminder. Defeating Vietnam would not be as simple as drawing arrows on a map. While Togon's army occupied an empty capital and starved in silence, another Mongol force was carving its way south across the sea. Admiral Omar, commanding one of the most powerful navies the Mongols had ever assembled in East Asia, sailed confidently into Vietnamese waters. At his back trailed the lifeline of the entire invasion, the massive supply fleet commanded by Zhang Wenhu. Nearly 500 warships and 70 supply boats carried enough food, salt, and dried meat to sustain the Mongol armies for months. To Togon and the Mongol generals, this fleet meant security. No matter how scorched the Vietnamese fields became, no matter how empty the cities were, food and reinforcements would flow endlessly from the sea, or so they thought. Waiting in the shadows was a man who understood the stakes better than anyone, Trần Hưng Đạo, a brilliant general of the Trần dynasty. He knew that defeating the Mongols wasn't about fighting their armies head-on. It was about cutting the veins of their war machine, the supply lines. At Van Don, as Zhang Wenhu's supply fleet advanced, Trần Hưng Đạo struck. His smaller, lighter ships darted in and out of the Mongol formation, launching fire arrows and hit-and-run attacks. At first, the Mongols were caught off guard. Then chaos erupted. Massive transport ships carrying thousands of sacks of rice and meat burst into flames. Supply boats sank beneath the waves. Desperate Mongol sailors leapt into the sea, only to drown or be cut down. Within hours, the fleet that was meant to feed the invasion was annihilated. When news of the disaster reached the Mongol High Command, the effect was devastating. The army in Thung Long was already struggling. Now, the very supplies they depended on were gone. Winter was coming fast. The soldiers were starving. The horses were collapsing. And for the first time, the Mongols, the conquerors of half the known world, were trapped in enemy territory without a lifeline. Prince Togon could feel the walls closing in. But what he didn't realize was that his navy, under Admiral Omar, was sailing straight into the most deadly trap the Vietnamese had ever prepared. With the Mongols weakened and their supply fleet destroyed, Trần Hưng Đạo prepared to deliver the final blow. But instead of striking recklessly, he chose his battlefield with care. He knew that in order to destroy the Mongol navy, he needed more than courage, he needed the river itself as an ally. That river was the Bạch Đằng. The Bạch Đằng was no ordinary waterway. Its tides were fierce and unpredictable, rising and falling with such force that entire fleets could be stranded or swept away in a matter of hours. Generations earlier, another Vietnamese hero, Ngo Quyen, had used this very river to trap and annihilate a Chinese fleet. Trần Hưng Đạo knew the legend, and he planned to do the same, on an even greater scale. His men worked tirelessly, often at night, driving thousands of sharpened wooden stakes deep into the riverbed. Each stake was carefully hidden beneath the water, their tops cut to resemble nothing more than driftwood or brush. At high tide, they disappeared completely beneath the surface. To an approaching fleet, the river looked calm, safe, inviting. But when the tide dropped, the truth would be revealed. The stakes were not only sharp, they were angled, upstream. Any ship caught on them would be pierced and stuck fast, unable to escape as the current pulled it deeper into the trap. And the Mongols, who relied on their massive warships, were the perfect prey. Trần Hưng Đạo did not rush the ambush. He waited. He studied the tides. He timed every detail. The plan required precision, patience, and discipline. But above all, it required the Mongols to believe they were chasing victory, when in fact, they were sailing into a graveyard. By early April of 1288, the stage was set. Admiral Omar's fleet, unaware of the supply disaster that had doomed Togon's army, was pushing deeper into Vietnamese waters. He believed reinforcements and supplies would meet him. Instead, he was sailing straight toward the sharpened teeth of the Bạch Đằng River. On the morning of the 9th of April, 1288, Admiral Omar steered his fleet into the lower reaches of the Bạch Đằng River. The tide was rising, the waters deep, and the path seemed clear. From the Mongol decks, victory still looked certain. Ahead of them, they spotted Vietnamese ships, smaller, lighter, darting quickly across the water. Trần Hưng Đạo himself had ordered a probing attack just enough to make the enemy believe his fleet was retreating in panic. The ruse worked perfectly. Omar, convinced that the Vietnamese were fleeing, gave the order, "Pursue them at all costs." The Mongol fleet surged forward. War drums thundered. Archers readied their bows. Ship after ship pressed deeper into the river, chasing what they believed was a fleeing enemy. But the Vietnamese weren't running. They were luring. And then the tide turned. Literally. The waters that had lifted the Mongol ships now began to drop with terrifying speed. The mighty warships, suddenly too heavy for the shallowing river, slammed down onto the hidden forest of stakes. The sound was like thunder hulls splintering, wood cracking, iron nails twisting. One by one, Mongol ships ground to a halt, their keels torn open by sharpened spikes. Water poured in. Panic spread instantly. Sailors shouted, oarsmen struggled, but the current dragged them deeper into the trap. That was the signal Trần Hưng Đạo had been waiting for. From the surrounding mountains, horns and drums roared. Vietnamese forces attacked from all sides. From the banks of Trang Ken Mountain, archers unleashed a storm of arrows. From the Yanheng River, warships surged in, slamming into the immobilized Mongol fleet. Soldiers leapt aboard enemy decks, blades flashing, torches setting sails ablaze. The Bạch Đằng River became a slaughterhouse. General Phan Thiep, desperate to save the fleet, tried to land troops on Trong Ken Mountain to break the ambush, but hidden Vietnamese forces erupted from the forests, cutting down his men in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Mongol ships collided in panic, crushing their own sailors. Others capsized as terrified men leapt overboard, only to drown in the current or be cut down in the water. Blood turned the river red. Through it all, Trần Hưng Đạo himself, alongside both emperors of the Trần dynasty, personally led elite troops into battle. The sight electrified the Đại Việt army, while the Mongols, trapped and leaderless, spiraled into chaos. Hours passed. The Mongol navy, once so feared, collapsed piece by piece. By nightfall, the invincible empire of the steppes had suffered one of its most catastrophic defeats in history. As the last Mongol ships burned on the Bạch Đằng River, word spread to the inland forces under Prince Togon. The fleet, his lifeline, was gone. Supplies, reinforcements, and the possibility of retreat by sea had all vanished in a single day. The prince now faced a grim reality. His army was stranded in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies who knew every hill, every river, every narrow trail. At first, Togon tried to hold his ground. He ordered his soldiers to fortify positions, hoping perhaps to wait out the Vietnamese. But the land itself turned against him. The tropical heat bore down relentlessly. Mongol horses, already weakened from weeks of poor grazing, began to die in droves. Food rotted in the humidity. Men collapsed from exhaustion. The familiar steppes of Mongolia felt like another planet compared to this suffocating land of rivers and forests. And then came the Vietnamese ambushes. Trần Hưng Đạo knew better than to waste men on a head-on confrontation. Instead, he unleashed small, mobile units phantoms in the jungle. At night, Mongol camps would suddenly erupt in chaos as arrows rained from the trees. By day, supply lines were cut, stragglers picked off, foragers slaughtered. The psychological toll was immense. Every shadow looked like an enemy. Every rustle in the grass could mean death. The once proud Mongol soldiers who had terrified Eurasia now marched nervously through the forests, weapons clutched tight, eyes darting in fear. Starvation soon followed. With no fleet to resupply him, and local villages burning their own food stores to deny the invaders, Togon's army began to wither. Soldiers ate roots, bark, even leather straps torn from their own armor. Disease spread through the weakened ranks. Malaria, dysentery, fevers with no cure. Finally, Togon made the decision: retreat. But retreat was not salvation. It was another death march. As the Mongol column pulled back toward the north, the Vietnamese struck without mercy. Ambushes hit them in mountain passes. Arrows tore into their ranks as they crossed rivers. Whole units were swallowed in sudden assaults, never to be seen again. By the time Togon staggered across the border back into China, his once mighty force was nothing but a broken remnant. Of the vast army that had marched south with dreams of conquest, only a fraction survived. And the prince himself? Humiliated, disgraced, he would never again command such an expedition. The Mongol dream of crushing Đại Việt had drowned in the waters of the Bạch Đằng and bled out in the jungles of the north. When the smoke cleared and the last Mongol soldier limped out of Đại Việt, the world had witnessed something extraordinary. The greatest war machine of the medieval era, the empire of Genghis Khan and his heirs, had been stopped cold, not once, not twice, but 3 times by a kingdom many had dismissed as small and insignificant. For Đại Việt, this was more than just a military triumph. It was survival, freedom, and pride rolled into one. Villages that had been burned rebuilt themselves. Families mourned their dead but knew they had preserved their homeland. And at the heart of it all stood Trần Hưng Đạo, the commander who became a legend. His strategies would be studied for centuries, his name whispered with reverence, his victories seen as proof that brilliance and determination could topple even the mightiest foes. For the Mongols, it was a bitter humiliation. Togon returned north in disgrace, and the Yuan court struggled to explain how their unstoppable empire had been undone by a land of rivers and jungles. Never again would the Mongols launch a campaign of such scale against Đại Việt. The lesson had been learned. Conquest here came at too high a cost. But the story of Đại Vit's resistance didn't just echo in Asia. Across the world, stories of the defeat spread. In an age when Mongol banners cast shadows from Poland to Korea, the fact that this small kingdom in Southeast Asia had withstood them became a beacon of hope for others. It showed that even the mightiest empire could bleed. Centuries later, the battles of the Bạch Đằng River still live on, not just in history books, but in folk songs, monuments, and national memory. They are remembered not merely as victories in war, but as moments when a people proved their resilience against impossible odds. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is this: empires rise, armies march, kings and princes make their claims. But in the end, it is often the will of ordinary people, the villagers who burned their own crops, the soldiers who fought in the forests, the commander who risked everything that decides the fate of history. The Mongols were feared everywhere they went, yet in the rivers of Đại Việt, they met their match. It wasn't just a battle, it was a warning to every empire that would ever dream of conquest. Sometimes, the smallest nations leave the biggest scars on history.